Instead of so-called Gay Pride Month or Black History or any of the others, I nominate a Fix History Month, whereby we correct the months of the year, move up the months to match their etymology. For instance, October refers to 8, like octopus, because it was originally the 8th month. November is from novem, 9, because it was originally the 9th month. December, decem, 10, was the 10th month, etc. These things were thrown out of alignment when megalomaniacal Caesars, Julius and Augustus, crammed their names into the calendar. I suggest replacing July and August with new months, namely Daniel and Natal. In a previous episode, I mentioned Herbert Spencer's book, Studies in Sociology. It was important because in 1873, it was the very first work of sociology. I noticed that modern sociologists try to discourage students from reading this foundational text, and I wondered why. So I got the book. It quickly became evident why modern academia tried to suppress Spencer. He makes a lot of the same points that modern conservatives make, even though he was a liberal at the time. One of the points was that government legislation wasn't the solution to everything, that in fact it sometimes messed things up. The modern field of sociology is a leftist cesspool, so for them, this is thought crime. Another ideological transgression committed by Spencer was his pointing out how societies function, and how the aggregate of a nation reflected each individual unit within the nation. For instance, if the aggregate is called Japan, the individual unit would be called the Japanese citizen. Without these Japanese citizens, you can't logically have Japan. He starts out by talking about stacking cannonballs to make a pyramid, and how that pyramid is based on the individual units of the balls. If the balls are all more or less the same, it conduces to stability of the larger stack. The aggregate takes on the character of the individual units. Listen here.
Chapter 3. Nature of the Social Science. Out of bricks well burnt, hard and sharp-angled, lying in heaps by his side, the bricklayer builds, even without mortar, a wall of some height that has considerable stability. With bricks made of bad materials, irregularly burnt, warped, cracked, and many of them broken, he cannot build a dry wall of the same height and stability. The dockyard laborer piling cannon shot is totally unable to make these spherical masses stand at all as the bricks stand. There are indeed certain definite shapes into which they may be piled. That of a tetrahedron, or that of a pyramid having a square base, or that of an elongated wedge allied to the pyramid. In any of these forms, they may be put together symmetrically and stably, but not in forms with vertical sides or highly inclined sides. Once more, if instead of equal spherical shot, the masses to be piled are boulders partially but irregularly rounded, and of various sizes, no definite stable form is possible. A loose heap indefinite in its surface and angles is all the laborer can make of them. Putting which several facts together and asking what is the most general truth they imply, we see it to be this, that the character of the aggregate is determined by the character of the units. If we pass from units of these visible, tangible kinds to the units contemplated by chemists and physicists as making up masses of matter, the same truth meets us. Each so-called element, each combination of elements, each recombination of the compounds, has a form of crystallization. Though its crystals differ in their sizes and are liable to be modified by truncations of angles and apices, as well as by partial mergings into one another, yet the type of structure as shown by cleavage is constant. Particular kinds of molecules severally have particular shapes into which they settle themselves as they aggregate. And though in some cases it happens that a substance, simple or compound, has 2 or even more forms of aggregation, yet the recognized interpretation is that these different forms are the forms assumed by molecules made different in their structure by allotropic or isomeric changes. So constant is the relation between the nature of any molecules and their mode of crystallizing that given 2 kinds of molecules which are known, from their chemical actions, to be closely allied in their natures, and it is inferred with certainty that their crystals will be closely allied. In brief, it may be unhesitatingly affirmed as an outcome of physics and chemistry that throughout all phenomena presented by dead matter, the natures of the units necessitate certain traits in the aggregates. This truth is again exemplified by aggregates of living matter. In the substance of each species of plant or animal, there is a proclivity towards the structure which that plant or animal presents, a proclivity conclusively proved in cases where the conditions of the maintenance of life are sufficiently simple, and where the tissue has not assumed a structure too finished to permit rearrangement. The perpetually cited case of the polyp, each part of which, when it is cut into several, presently puts on the polyp shape and gains structures and powers like those of the original whole, illustrates this truth among animals. Among plants it is well exemplified by the begonias. Here a complete plant grows from a fragment of a leaf stuck in the ground. And in Begonia philomaniaca, complete plants grow even out of scales that fall from the leaves in the stem. A fact showing, like the fact which the polyp furnishes, that the units everywhere present have for their type of aggregation the type of the organism they belong to.
The concept that Spencer is talking about at the end is what we today call self-similarity. One small piece of the polyp snipped off will replicate the complete polyp if allowed to regrow. Likewise, one small fragment of a begonia, if replanted, will replicate the whole begonia. Spencer goes on to make the point that likewise, the individual units in a society recreate the characteristics of the aggregate society. For instance, if you take Westerners out of their original habitat and maroon them on a desert island, you'll see that, like the polyp or begonia, they remake their original society. Like in this clip from a show called The Island, where British people are shipwrecked in the middle of the Pacific. Note how they eventually recreate their own political system thousands of miles away from home.
Quite interesting what's happened in the last few days, because the group is beginning to split, essentially. It's incredible. We're just not eating enough. We're just not eating enough. There's just something on my mind I wanted to sort of share with you. I think it's no secret that there are fracture lines appearing within our group. That's no secret. We could think about electing a leader, someone who can, bring unity to all of us.
I think we're too late into this to suddenly come up with a whole new structure which is going to
Well, I disagree with you, but I
Yeah.
sort of believe in seizing the moment, and I think this is the moment to
I
seize
think it's
it.
way too late.
Mate, I think this is the time to seize the moment, and, if we're going to let this moment pass, then I think we're all doing ourselves a disservice.
If a leader is elected, it will be a leader's job to make sure that everyone is doing the things they've undertaken to do.
Where Herbert Spencer got into trouble with modern globalists is that he asserted that the society reflected the characteristics of the individual people within it. In other words, if you transplant Europeans anywhere, they'll recreate a European society. It's the concept of self-similarity. In the book Scale, by Geoffrey West, he talks about how systems scale up or down. In the case of fractals, he touches on the aforementioned phenomenon called self-similarity, in which patterns repeat in the microcosm and on the macrocosm. West writes, most biological networks like the circulatory system exhibit the intriguing geometric property of being a fractal. You're probably familiar with the idea. Simply put, fractals are objects that look approximately the same at all scales or at any level of magnification. A classic example is a cauliflower or head of broccoli shown opposite. If broccoli is broken into smaller pieces, each piece looks like a reduced-sized version of the original. When scaled back up to the size of the whole, each piece appears indistinguishable from the original. This repetitive phenomenon is called self-similarity and is a generic characteristic of fractals. Plato seemed to agree with Herbert Spencer that just as with fractal self-similarity, the man was a reflection of his society. In the Republic, Socrates is asked what justice is. He says that it's difficult to ascertain it within a man. So, to make viewing easier, he suggested magnifying the man up into the society and looking for justice in the larger civilization. Here's the quote. First, let us complete the old investigation, which we began, as you remember, under the impression that if we could previously examine justice on the larger scale, there would be less difficulty in discerning her in the individual. That larger example appeared to be the state, and accordingly we constructed as good a one as we could, knowing well that in the good state, justice would be found. Let the discovery which we made be now applied to the individual. Back to Herbert Spencer, though. At the beginning of Chapter 3 of Studies in Sociology, he makes the point that when you build a brick wall, it helps if the bricks are all standardized. If they're all diverse, oddly shaped, then the wall will be unstable and collapse. Likewise in a society, disrupt a common culture and you create precariousness. The less regular and similar the individual units are, the less stable the aggregate is. To return to Spencer.
And reminding us of the universal fact that the units composing every germ, animal, or vegetal have a proclivity towards the parental type of aggregation. Thus, given the natures of the units, and the nature of the aggregate they form is predetermined. I say the nature, meaning of course the essential traits and not including the incidental. By the character of the units are necessitated certain limits within which the characters of the aggregate must fall. The circumstances attending aggregation greatly modify the results. But the truth here to be recognized is that these circumstances, in some cases perhaps preventing aggregation altogether, in other cases impeding it, in other cases facilitating it more or less, can never give to the aggregate characters that do not consist with the characters of the units. No favoring conditions will give the laborer power to pile cannon shot into a vertical wall. No favoring conditions will make it possible for common salt, which crystallizes on the regular system, to crystallize like sulfate of soda on the oblique prismatic system. No favoring conditions will enable the fragment of a polyp to take on the structure of a mollusk. Among such social aggregates as inferior creatures fall into, more or less definitely, the same truth holds. Whether they live in a mere assemblage or whether they live in something like an organized union with division of labor among its members, as happens in many cases, is unquestionably determined by the properties of the units. Given the structures and consequent instincts of the individuals as we find them, and the community they form will inevitably present certain traits. And no community having such traits can be formed out of individuals having other structures and instincts. Those who have been brought up in the belief that there is one law for the rest of the universe and another law for mankind will doubtless be astonished by the proposal to include aggregates of men in this generalization.
That last sentence, about some people thinking that the laws of nature don't apply to men, implies that they're delusional. The assertion that you can maintain Japan by replacing its population with Nigerians, that you can ensure the posterity of England by importing Pakistan. We're told today that from a clipping of a polyp, we can get a mollusk. Of course, no such thing is true. I mean, consider the previous example of marooning people on an island who unconsciously recreate their original society. Could you do that with, say, Somali Representative Ilhan Omar? According to the laws of self-similarity, would she reproduce American culture? That's not her background. Her instincts were shaped by other cultural factors. So if you marooned a bunch of Ilhan Omars, the society they'd recreate would be more like Sharia law and consanguineous marriages. She's no more likely to replicate American culture than oranges will be able to replicate apple juice. And that's the problem. According to Hegel, a constitution is the embodiment of a particular people, and he says that the whole point of government is to perpetuate the ethos of that people. Can you perpetuate the ethos of one people by replacing them with another? We're given a false answer to this by corporate America. The economic system wants cheap labor, so it desires open, endless immigration, and it claims that this won't alter America. Our ancestors didn't believe that. Why? Because it's absurd. It's patently false. But because of economic influences, we're told to suspend critical thinking and to assume that if all the individual units are apples, we can get a crate of pears in the aggregate. If you have a bottle of champagne and switch out the contents with Coca-Cola, that it will remain champagne. At any rate, I end this presentation now, going from fractal self-similarity to fractured societies, expressing sympathy for poor Herbert Spencer, who's blacklisted now for telling the truth in a time period where lies are state policy. Conversations That Matter, hosted by Alex Newman, interviews key people with important information to share that they, big government, don't want you to hear. Information that might save your life and family, literally, as well as your liberty. Check it out on thenewamerican.com.